Girl says, "I know you, your photo is in my dad's wallet," to Millionaire, leaving him shocked. The autumn wind whipped through the cemetery, scattering fallen leaves across the freshly dug grave. David Mitchell stood frozen behind a distant oak tree, his expensive suit offering little protection against the biting cold. Through the branches, he watched as mourners gathered around his mother's final resting place, their black attire blending into a somber sea of grief. Michael, his younger brother, stood at the forefront, one arm protectively wrapped around 8-year-old Emma. Even from this distance, David could see the exhaustion etched into Michael's face, the toll of months spent caring for their dying mother while raising a child alone. The priest's words carried on the wind, fragments of prayers and remembrances that made David's chest tighten with regret. He had been in Tokyo when the final call came, closing a multi-million-dollar deal that seemed monumentally insignificant now. By the time his plane touched down, she was already gone. A movement caught his eye. Michael had turned, perhaps sensing his presence, and their eyes met across the cemetery grounds. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. The weight of a decade's worth of missed opportunities, broken promises, and unspoken words hung heavy between them. Michael's expression hardened, a mixture of pain, anger, and something deeper, disappointment. Emma looked up at her father, then followed his gaze, her innocent eyes finding David in his hiding place. She tugged at Michael's sleeve, asking a question David couldn't hear. Michael's response was clear, though he turned away, shielding Emma from the sight of the uncle she had never met. David's phone vibrated in his pocket, another urgent message from the office. His fingers trembled as he reached for it, a practiced motion that had become his escape from reality. The message glowed on the screen board: "Meeting in 30 minutes. Your presence is crucial." One last look at the funeral gathering. One last chance to step forward, to face his family, to begin making amends. Instead, David Mitchell did what he had perfected over the years. He turned and walked away, each step taking him further from his family and deeper into his self-imposed exile. He never saw Michael's eyes following him, never noticed his brother's hand tightening around the worn photograph in his wallet, the last picture of their family together, taken before success had become David's only measure of worth. If you found yourself drawn into this tale of family, redemption, and the choices that define us, there's much more to come. Subscribe now to unlock the full emotional journey and discover if love truly can heal the deepest wounds. Success had always been David Mitchell's North Star, his singular pursuit that overshadowed everything else in his life. From the moment he left his small hometown, armed with nothing but ambition and a business degree, he had mapped out every step of his ascent to the top. The cramped apartment he shared with 3 roommates in his early 20s became a corner office with a view of Manhattan by 30. Every sacrifice was calculated, every relationship evaluated for its potential return on investment. The first major deal he closed bought him his Rolex. The second paid for his Mercedes. By the time he made partner, he had forgotten the sound of his mother's voice on their weekly calls that gradually became monthly, then quarterly, until they stopped altogether. Success, he discovered, was a demanding mistress that left little room for sentimentality. His company, Mitchell Enterprises, grew from a small consulting firm into a global powerhouse under his leadership. Each victory fed his hunger for more, each achievement pushing him further from the modest roots he had worked so hard to escape. The business magazines lauded his ruthless efficiency, his ability to spot opportunities where others saw only risk. The Mitchell touch, they called it, the uncanny knack for turning struggling companies into gold mines. But success exacted its price in silence. The family dinners he missed became years of absence. His mother's illness, when he first heard about it, was just another problem to be solved with money. He sent the best doctors, paid for the finest care, but never once sat by her bedside. Michael's desperate phone calls about her deteriorating condition were screened by his assistant, relegated to voice messages he was always too busy to return. The day he closed his biggest deal, a $2.5 billion merger that made headlines across Wall Street, was the same day his mother asked for him one last time. He had promised to visit that weekend, another promise that would go unkept. The contract signing ran long, the celebrations even longer. By the time he checked his phone, it was too late. Michael's message was brief: she's gone. Don't bother coming now. But David's empire continued to grow, but the cost of his success began to manifest in the emptiness of his achievements. His penthouse apartment, filled with expensive art and designer furniture, echoed with solitude. The board members who praised his business acumen couldn't replace the family he had left behind. Even his relationships became transactional, brief affairs with women who understood that his work would always come first. The newspapers painted him as a business virtuoso, a self-made billionaire who had written his own rules for success. They never mentioned the family photos he had locked away in his desk drawer, or the Christmas cards from Michael that arrived each year, unopened and unanswered. The business world celebrated his independence, never suspecting that each new achievement only deepened his isolation. As his wealth grew, so did the walls he built around himself. His assistant managed his personal life with the same efficiency she brought to his business affairs. Birthdays, holidays, family milestones, all were reduced to calendar entries that could be easily ignored or rescheduled. The young man who had once dreamed of making his family proud had become a stranger to them, a distant figure whose success meant nothing to the people who had once meant everything to him. Years passed, and David Mitchell became exactly what he had always wanted to be: successful, powerful, respected. But in the quiet moments between deals, in the late hours when his office overlooked a sleeping city, he sometimes found himself staring at his reflection in the window, wondering if the price of success had been too high. These moments of doubt were quickly buried under new projects, new acquisitions, new distractions that kept him from confronting the void his ambition had created. While David chased billions in Manhattan, Michael Mitchell's world revolved around a small house in the suburbs and a little girl who had lost too much too soon. Every morning began the same way: waking at dawn to pack Emma's lunch, checking her homework, and braiding her hair just the way Sarah had done before the accident. The little girl's eyes, so much like her mother's, held a wisdom beyond her years, the kind that comes from understanding loss too early. Life as a single father wasn't what Michael had planned. Sarah's death in a car accident 3 years ago had left him drowning in grief, while trying to keep their daughter afloat. The insurance money barely covered the funeral expenses, and his teaching salary at the local high school stretched thin across mortgage payments, groceries, and Emma's growing needs. Yet he refused to touch the check David had sent: blood money. He called it compensation for years of absence. The walls of their modest home told the story of their small family. Photos of Sarah smiled down from every corner, frozen in time. Michael kept them up, not just for Emma, but as a reminder of the happiness they'd once known. Between parent-teacher conferences and soccer practices, he struggled to be both mother and father to a child who asked questions he wasn't always prepared to answer. Why doesn't Uncle David visit? Emma would ask. Why did Mummy have to go away? Each question was a knife twisting in his heart. The hardest moments came at night, after Emma was asleep. Michael would sit at the kitchen table, surrounded by unpaid bills and unopened letters from David's lawyers' attempts to help that felt more like charity than brotherhood. He worked extra shifts tutoring, took summer school assignments, anything to keep them afloat without accepting help from the brother who hadn't even bothered to attend their mother's last Christmas. The local community became their surrogate family. Other parents took turns driving Emma to soccer practice when Michael had to work late. His students' parents, knowing his situation, often sent extra food with their children, claiming they'd made too much. The kindness of strangers proved more reliable than the promises of family. But there were moments when the weight became almost unbearable, like when Emma made the soccer team and looked around the crowd for a mother who would never cheer her on, or during the father-daughter dance at school, when she clung to Michael with a desperation that spoke of her fear of losing him too. These were the times when Michael's anger at David burned hottest, not for abandoning him, but for missing out on the miracle that was their niece. The photo in Michael's wallet, the one Emma had spotted, was more than just a picture of David. It was a reminder of what they'd lost: the brother who had once taught him to ride a bike, who had defended him from bullies, who had promised to always be there. That brother had died long ago, replaced by a stranger whose success was measured in dollar signs rather than the currency of family bonds. Each night, after finishing the dishes and checking Emma's backpack for the next day, Michael would sit in her doorway, watching her sleep. In these quiet moments, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his solitude. His daughter was his world, his reason for pushing forward, but the burden of being everything to someone while having no one to lean on himself was crushing. Still, he chose this struggle over David's hollow offers of financial support. Some prices, he knew, were too high to pay. The rift between David and Michael Mitchell wasn't born in a single moment, but grew like a crack in a foundation, spreading slowly until the damage became irreparable. Their last real conversation had been 10 years ago, on a crisp autumn evening when their mother's illness had first been diagnosed. Michael had called, desperation in his voice, begging David to come home. Instead of comfort, he received a wire transfer and promises to handle everything from a distance. Years of built-up resentment exploded that night. "She's dying," David Michael had shouted into the phone. "She doesn't need your money, she needs her son." David's response, cool and calculated, became the epitaph of their brotherhood: "I have meetings I can't reschedule. The money will provide better care than I could anyway." The line went dead, and with it, the last thread of understanding between them. Their differences had always existed. David was the ambitious one, seeing their small town upbringing as a cage to escape. Michael found purpose in simpler things: teaching high school students, coaching little league, being present for family dinners. Where David sought validation in boardrooms, Michael found it in his students' successes and his mother's proud smile. The discovery of Sarah's existence, their sister given up for adoption before either of them was born, should have brought them together. Instead, it became another weapon in their arsenal of hurt. Michael had learned the truth during their mother's final days, a confession whispered between morphine doses. By then, David was unreachable, buried in mergers and acquisitions, his assistant filtering all calls from home. Their interactions became purely transactional. David's lawyers sent papers offering financial support. Michael returned them unsigned. Birthday cards arrived with checks enclosed. They were shredded without response. The distance between Manhattan and their hometown measured more than miles. It spanned a gulf of unspoken words, missed opportunities, and hardened hearts. Even Emma's birth hadn't bridged the divide. David sent an expensive baby gift through his assistant. Michael donated it to charity. When Sarah died in the accident 3 years later, David's condolence letter came on company letterhead, accompanied by another check. Michael's response was a single photo of Emma, returned to sender with the words, "She deserves more than your money," scrawled across the back. The brothers became strangers who shared DNA, but nothing else. David's success made headlines. Michael's struggles remained private. They existed in parallel universes, one filled with board meetings and billion-dollar deals, the other with homework help and soccer games. Their mother's death should have been a wake-up call, a chance for reconciliation. Instead, it became the final nail in the coffin of their relationship, with David watching the funeral from afar rather than standing beside his brother in shared grief. Only the photograph in Michael's wallet remained as evidence of their former closeness, a reminder of two boys who had once been inseparable, who had promised to always be there for each other. It was this photo that Emma would discover, setting in motion events that would force both brothers to confront the true cost of their estrangement. The morning that changed everything began like any other in the Mitchell household. 8-year-old Emma sat at the kitchen table, her legs swinging beneath her chair as she watched her father rush around gathering his teaching materials. Michael was running late for his first class, his tie askew and his hair still uncombed. In his haste, his wallet fell from his back pocket, spilling its contents across the worn linoleum floor. "I'll help," Daddy Emma chirped, sliding from her chair and dropping to her knees to gather the scattered cards and receipts. That's when she saw a photograph, worn at the edges and creased down the middle, partially hidden beneath a grocery receipt. The image captured two young men, arms around each other's shoulders, their smiles wide and genuine. One was clearly her father, younger but unmistakable. The other man she had never seen before, yet something about him felt familiar. Emma held the photo up to the morning light streaming through the kitchen window. "Daddy," she called out, curiosity filling her voice. "Who's this with you in the picture?" Michael froze, his hand halfway to his coffee cup. For a moment he said nothing, and Emma watched a series of emotions flash across his face: pain, anger, something that looked like longing. "That's no one, sweetheart," he finally said, reaching for the photo. But Emma, with the innocence of childhood, held onto it, studying the stranger's face more closely. "He looks like you, Daddy. Is he family?" Her words hung in the air like morning mist, heavy with unasked questions. Michael sank into the kitchen chair, his lateness forgotten. He stared at the photo in Emma's small hands, remembering the day it was taken David's college graduation, before success had carved a canyon between them. "That's your Uncle David," he said softly, the name feeling foreign on his tongue after so many years of silence. Emma's eyes widened. "I have an uncle?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder and confusion. "Why haven't I ever met him?" The question pierced Michael's heart like a blade. How could he explain to an 8-year-old the complexities of adult relationships, the way pride and ambition could tear families apart? "He lives far away," Michael began, but Emma's attention was already back on the photo. "He looks important," she observed, tracing the outline of David's face with her finger. "Like those businessmen on TV." Michael couldn't help but smile at her perception. "Yes, he is important," he agreed. "He's a very successful businessman in New York." "Does he know about me?" Emma asked, her innocent question loaded with implications Michael wasn't ready to face. "Does he know I'm his niece?" The morning sun caught the tears welling in her eyes, and Michael felt his resolve crumbling. For years he had protected Emma from the pain of David's absence, but perhaps in doing so, he had denied her something too. "He knows about you," Michael said carefully, pulling Emma onto his lap. "But sometimes grown-ups make complicated choices that keep them apart, even when they're family." Emma leaned back against his chest, still holding the photo. "That's sad," she said simply, with the profound wisdom children sometimes possess. Michael looked at his watch. He was now officially late for his first class, but as Emma sat there, studying the uncle she had never met, he knew this moment was more important than any lesson he could teach today. "Would you like to hear about him?" he asked, surprising himself with the offer. Emma nodded eagerly, and for the first time in years, Michael found himself talking about David, not the successful businessman who had abandoned them, but the brother who had once taught him to throw a baseball, who had helped him with his math homework, who had promised to always be there. As he spoke, Michael realized the photo had survived countless wallet cleanings, numerous attempts to discard it, because some part of him had never stopped hoping for reconciliation. Now, watching Emma's fascination with this newfound family connection, he wondered if perhaps his daughter's innocent discovery might be the first step toward healing wounds he had long considered permanent. The reunion happened on a crisp autumn morning in Central Park, where David Mitchell took his daily run to escape the suffocating pressure of his penthouse and corporate responsibilities. He was focused on his breathing, his expensive running shoes pounding against the pavement, when a small voice cut through his concentration like a knife through silk. "I know you," the voice said, clear and confident. "Your photo is in my dad's wallet." David stopped mid-stride, his heart hammering not from exertion but from the sight before him. A little girl with familiar eyes stood on the path, her backpack clutched tightly to her chest. Emma. It had to be Emma. He had seen enough photos sent by his lawyers to recognize his niece, though the reality of her presence hit him with unexpected force. "Emma," he managed, his voice barely a whisper. Before she could respond, another voice, deeper, harder, filled with a decade of hurt cut through the morning air. "Emma, what did I tell you about running ahead?" Michael appeared around the corner, his face dropping as he spotted his brother. Time seemed to freeze as the Mitchell brothers faced each other for the first time since their mother's funeral. Michael's face hardened into a mask of protective anger. "Emma, come here," he commanded, but Emma stood her ground, looking between the two men with curiosity. "Daddy, it's Uncle David from the picture. I found him." Her innocent excitement cut through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. David took a step forward, his usual corporate confidence nowhere to be found. "Michael," he began, but words failed him. "How do you apologize for 10 years of absence in a chance encounter in the park?" Michael's laugh was bitter, cutting. "Save it, David. Your lawyers have said enough over the years." But Emma, oblivious to the undercurrents of adult pain, had other ideas. "Daddy said you live in New York," she announced, moving closer to David. "He told me stories about when you were little." Michael's face flickered with something surprise, perhaps, that he had shared anything positive about his estranged brother. "Emma," Michael warned again, but his daughter continued, "Did you really teach Daddy how to ride a bike?" He said you never let him fall. The simple question, laden with childhood memories, hit both brothers like a physical blow. David's throat tightened as he remembered that summer day, the pride in protecting his little brother, the promise he had made and broken to always be there. "Yes," David said softly, his eyes meeting Michael's. "I did." For a moment, something shifted in Michael's expression, a crack in the armor of anger he had built over the years. Emma beamed, stepping closer to David. "Will you teach me too? Daddy tries, but he says he's not very good at it." The request hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. David looked at Michael, seeking permission, forgiveness, understanding everything that had been lost between them. Michael's jaw clenched, but Emma's hopeful expression wore down his defenses. "Emma, we need to go," Michael said finally, but his voice had lost its edge. "You're going to be late for school." Emma's face fell, but then brightened with an idea. "Can Uncle David come to my soccer game on Saturday? Please, Daddy." The question forced both brothers to confront the possibility of reconciliation. David, who had moved mountains in business deals, found himself holding his breath, waiting for his brother's answer. Michael looked at his daughter, then at his brother, seeing both the man who had abandoned them and the boy who had once been his protector. "That's up to your uncle," Michael said finally, his words carrying the weight of a potential olive branch. "He's a very busy man." The last words held a trace of their old hurt, but also an opening, small, fragile, but real. David, for the first time in years, chose family over business. "I'll be there," he said firmly, meeting Michael's gaze. "What time?" Emma squealed with delight, while Michael's expression remained guarded but no longer hostile. As they parted ways, David watched his brother and niece disappear into the morning crowd, knowing that this chance encounter had shifted something fundamental in their fractured relationship. Saturday arrived with the weight of expectation hanging heavy in the autumn air. David arrived at the soccer field 30 minutes early, dressed in casual clothes that felt foreign against his skin after years of tailored suits. He sat in his luxury car, watching families arrive with their folding chairs and coolers, feeling like an outsider in this world of normal weekend routines. Emma spotted him first, her face lighting up as she ran across the field in her bright yellow soccer uniform. "Uncle David, you came," she called out, waving enthusiastically. Michael followed more slowly, his expression a complex mixture of resignation and wariness. He carried 2 lawn chairs, pointedly not bringing a third for his brother. "I promised I would," David replied, awkwardly accepting Emma's spontaneous hug. The warmth of her small arms around his waist caught him off guard. When was the last time anyone had hugged him with such unconditional acceptance? Michael cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "Emma, you need to warm up with your team." As Emma ran off to join her teammates, the brothers stood in uncomfortable silence. David gestured toward the field. She seems happy. Michael's response was curt, "No thanks to you." The words hung between them like a wall built of missed birthdays and unanswered calls. Throughout the game, David found himself drawn into Emma's world. She played with fierce determination, her face set in concentration as she chased the ball. When she scored a goal, her first instinct was to look toward the sidelines, seeking approval from both her father and her newly discovered uncle. David stood and cheered, earning a sideways glance from Michael. "She's good," David ventured during halftime. "She gets that from Sarah," Michael replied, the name of their deceased sister-in-law landing like a punch to David's gut. "You'd know that if you'd been around." The accusation was clear. David had missed not only Emma's childhood, but also the tragedy that had shaped it. After the game, Emma bounded over, her face flushed with excitement. "Did you see my goal, Uncle David? Dad says I'm getting better." Her enthusiasm was infectious, making it impossible for either brother to maintain their Cold War in her presence. "I did see it," David smiled. "You were amazing out there." "Can Uncle David come for ice cream with us?" Daddy Emma asked, looking between the two men with hopeful eyes. It's tradition after games. Michael hesitated, his protective instincts warring with his daughter's obvious happiness. "Emma, I'm sure your uncle has important business to attend to." David surprised them both by pulling out his phone and deliberately turning it off. "Actually, I'm free all afternoon." The gesture wasn't lost on Michael. He had seen David prioritize business calls over their mother's final days. This small act of choosing family over work sent a ripple through the carefully maintained distance between them. At the ice cream parlor, Emma dominated the conversation, filling the awkward silences with stories about school, soccer, and her friends. David listened intently, painfully aware of how much he had missed. When she mentioned her mother, both men tensed, but Emma continued naturally, as if Sarah's memory was a comfort rather than a source of pain. As they prepared to leave, Emma surprised them again. "Next Saturday is our last game of the season," she announced. "Will you come again?" Uncle David. The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. David looked at Michael, seeking permission without words. Michael's response was measured, guarded. "That's not up to me, Emma. Your uncle is a busy man." But something had shifted in his tone. The bitterness had softened, replaced by cautious consideration. David recognized the olive branch for what it was. "I'll be there," he promised, meeting Michael's eyes. "Every game, if you'll let me." The words carried the weight of a larger commitment, not just to soccer games, but to being present, to rebuilding what had been lost. As David watched them drive away in Michael's modest sedan, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: a sense of belonging. His phone remained off in his pocket, the endless stream of emails and messages forgotten. For the first time in a decade, he had chosen family over fortune, and the world hadn't ended. The revelation came on a quiet Sunday evening at Michael's house, after Emma had gone to bed. David had been coming to dinner regularly for a month, slowly rebuilding bridges he had once burned. They sat on the back porch, the silence between them more comfortable than it had been in years, when Michael finally spoke the words that would shatter David's understanding of their family. "There's something you need to know about Sarah," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. He pulled out a worn envelope from his jacket pocket, yellowed with age and creased from frequent handling. About Emma's mother. David tensed, sensing the weight of what was to come. "What about her?" David asked, watching as Michael's hands trembled slightly while opening the envelope. Inside was a letter, the handwriting immediately recognizable as their mother's. "Mom wrote this before she died," Michael continued. "She made me promise to tell you when the time was right. I've been carrying it for years, waiting for the moment when you might be ready to hear it." Michael handed the letter to David, who took it with uncharacteristic hesitation. His eyes scanned the first lines, and his world tilted on its axis. "My dearest sons, there is a truth I should have shared long ago. Before either of you were born, I had a daughter. Her name was Sarah, and I gave her up for adoption." David's hands shook as he read further. The story unfolded in their mother's elegant script: a teenage pregnancy, a forced adoption, years of silent grief. Sarah, the woman who had married Michael, the mother of Emma, wasn't just his sister-in-law. She was their sister. "This can't be," David whispered, but the truth resonated with an undeniable clarity. "All those years, when Sarah came into our lives, you knew." Michael nodded slowly, his face a mask of old pain. "Mom told me when she got sick. Sarah had found her first, traced her adoption records. They had a relationship for years before she met me. When we fell in love, Mom was terrified of telling us the truth." The implications hit David like physical blows. Emma wasn't just his niece by marriage, she was his blood, his family, in a deeper way than he had ever imagined. The child he had ignored for years carried his family's legacy, their mother's blood, their sister's spirit. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" David demanded, his voice cracking. Michael's laugh was bitter, tinged with years of hurt. "When should I have told you, David? During one of your rushed business calls? Through your lawyers? You weren't here. You weren't here when Mom was dying, when Sarah was killed, when Emma needed her uncle, her real uncle." The truth of Michael's words struck deeper than any business negotiation ever had. David remembered the funeral he had watched from afar, not just the funeral of a sister-in-law, but of a sister-in-law, but of a sister he had never known he had. A sister who had died never knowing her brother had become a stranger to his own family. Emma, David breathed, the name carrying new weight. "Does she know?" Michael shook his head. "How could I explain it to her? She's lost so much already. Her mother, her grandmother. I couldn't burden her with this too. Not yet." David stood abruptly, pacing the small porch as decades of memories realigned themselves with this new reality. Sarah's familiar smile, so like their mother's. The way she had tried to reach out to him before her death, messages he had ignored, assuming they were just Michael's attempts to reconnect. "The accident," David said suddenly, turning to Michael. "The day Sarah died, she was coming to see me. Wasn't she?" Michael's silence was answer enough. David sank back into his chair, the weight of guilt threatening to crush him. His sister had died trying to bridge the gap he had created, carrying a truth that might have changed everything. The days following Sarah's revelation became a blur of sleepless nights and haunted memories for David. Every interaction with Emma now carried new weight, each smile and gesture taking on deeper meaning as he recognized fragments of their shared bloodline. He began noticing things he'd overlooked before: the way she tilted her head when concentrating, just like their mother had done, or how her laugh echoed Sarah's in old family videos he'd finally forced himself to watch. One afternoon, as Emma practiced soccer in David's expansive backyard, he sat with Michael on the patio, watching their niece, their sister's daughter, chase after the ball with familiar determination. "She has Mom's spirit," David said quietly, the words catching in his throat. Michael nodded, his eyes never leaving Emma. "And Sarah's stubbornness. Sometimes it's like seeing them both at once." "I've been going through old photos," David admitted, pulling out a worn album he'd retrieved from his office safe. "Things I should have looked at years ago." He opened to a page showing their mother at Emma's age, the resemblance striking enough to take their breath away. The same eyes, the same determined set of the jaw, 3 generations of Mitchell women captured across time. "Sarah tried to tell me, didn't she?" David asked, his voice heavy with regret. "All those messages I ignored, the letters I sent back unopened." Michael's silence spoke volumes. Finally, he pulled out his wallet, removing not just the photo Emma had found, but another hidden behind it: Sarah at their mother's hospital bedside, both women smiling despite the circumstances, a secret shared between them. "She wanted you to know before Mom passed," Michael explained, his voice tight with emotion. "She said every child deserves to know their full story. But you were unreachable, buried in your empire building, by the time she decided to drive to New York herself." He couldn't finish the sentence. The weight of that fatal decision hung between them. David stood abruptly, walking to the edge of the yard where Emma was still practicing. She looked up at him with a bright smile, their mother's eyes shining from Sarah's face. "Uncle David, watch this," she called out, attempting a complicated kick she'd been working on. The word uncle now felt simultaneously too much and not enough. "How do we tell her?" David asked when he returned to his seat, his voice barely a whisper. "How do we explain that her mother was our sister? That she's not just my niece by marriage, but by blood?" Michael shook his head slowly, years of protecting Emma evident in his posture. "We don't. Not yet. She's lost enough without having to question everything she thought she knew about her family." But as they watched Emma play, her innocence untouched by the weight of their family's secrets, David felt the crushing responsibility of truth. "She'll find out eventually," he said. "And when she does, she'll want to know why we kept it from her." Michael's response was immediate, protective. "Then we make sure she knows she was loved. By all of us. By Sarah, by Mom, even by you, especially by you, even when you didn't know the full truth." Emma's laughter echoed across the yard as she finally mastered the kick she'd been practicing. She turned to them both, seeking approval, and David felt the full impact of their shared blood. This child, who had forgiven his absence so easily, who had welcomed him back into her life without question, carried not just Sarah's legacy, but their entire family's history in her veins. "I'm staying," David said suddenly, firmly. "No more business trips. No more missed moments. She deserves to know her family, all of it, and I want to be here when she's ready to learn the truth." Michael studied his brother's face, searching for any trace of the corporate mask he'd worn for so long. Finding none, he nodded slowly. As the evening shadows lengthened across David's manicured lawn, Michael reached into his worn leather messenger bag and pulled out a bundled stack of envelopes, held together with a faded blue ribbon. "There's more," he said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of years of secrets. "Sarah wrote to you, every week for months before the accident." David's hands trembled as he accepted the bundle. The envelopes were all addressed to his office in Manhattan, each one marked "Return to sender" in his assistant's precise handwriting. "I kept them all," Michael continued. "Even after the accident. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away." Opening the first letter, David recognized Sarah's flowing handwriting immediately. "Dear David," he read aloud, his voice catching. "I know this may come as a shock, but there's something you need to know about our family." The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. Letter after letter revealed Sarah's journey, discovering her adoption records, finding their mother, the shock of realizing her husband's brother was also her brother. "She never gave up trying to reach you," Michael said, watching as David sifted through the letters with increasing desperation. "Even when I told her it was hopeless, that you'd chosen your business over family, she insisted you deserved to know the truth. She believed in you, David, right until the end." The final letter was dated the day of the accident. It was unsealed, never sent. "I'm coming to see you," Sarah had written. "Some truths need to be spoken face to face. Mom wanted us all to be a family, and Emma deserves to know her uncle, her real uncle. I'll be there by afternoon." David's hands shook so violently that the letter fell to the ground. "She was coming to tell me in person," he whispered, the full horror of his actions finally hitting him. "If I had just answered one call, opened one letter." Michael picked up the fallen page, handling it with the reverence of a sacred text. "She left early that morning," Michael said, his voice distant with memory. "She was so determined. Said that even if you threw her out of your office, at least she would have tried. The truck driver, they said he fell asleep at the wheel. She never had a chance." The silence that followed was deafening. David stared at the stack of letters, each one representing a chance he'd squandered, a connection he'd refused to acknowledge. Why keep them, he finally asked. Why not destroy them after everything that happened? Michael was quiet for a long moment, absently touching the worn edges of the envelopes. "Because Emma asks about her mother," he said finally. "She wants to know everything about her. Someday she'll want to know why her uncle was absent for so long. These letters, they're proof that Sarah never gave up on family, that she believed in the power of truth, even when it was difficult. "I don't deserve this," David whispered, but Michael cut him off. "No, you don't. But Emma deserves to know that her mother fought for our family until the very end, that she saw good in you even when you couldn't see it in yourself." The weight of Sarah's forgiveness, preserved in these unopened letters, pressed down on David like a physical force. Each envelope represented a chance at redemption he'd carelessly discarded, too busy building his empire to notice his family crumbling around him. The process of rebuilding trust began with small gestures. David started showing up at Michael's house every morning before work, coffee in hand, just to sit in companionable silence while Emma got ready for school. At first, Michael's responses were guarded, limited to short nods and clipped answers, but gradually the ice began to thaw. David cleared his schedule every Thursday afternoon for Emma's soccer practice, arriving in casual clothes instead of his usual suits. He'd stand next to Michael on the sidelines, careful to maintain the physical and emotional distance his brother still needed, but present nonetheless. Sometimes they'd discuss Emma's improving skills, other times they'd just watch in silence, but it was a silence that grew more comfortable with each passing week. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during one of these practices. Emma had taken a hard fall on the field, and both men instinctively stepped forward in concern. As she picked herself up, flashing them a brave smile, Michael murmured, "She's tough, like Sarah." Instead of the usual tension that accompanied mentions of their sister, David felt something shift between them. "Tell me about her," David said quietly, his eyes still on Emma. "About Sarah, about their life together. I want to know everything I missed." Michael hesitated, then slowly began to share stories: Sarah's determination to make every moment count with Emma, her laugh during family dinners, her endless patience with both her daughter and her husband. With each story, David felt the weight of his absence more keenly, but also sensed Michael's walls beginning to crumble. David started handling the practical matters differently too. Instead of sending checks through his lawyers, he began asking Michael directly what Emma needed. When Michael mentioned her growing out of her soccer cleats, David didn't just order the most expensive pair online, he took them both to the sporting goods store, letting Emma try on different options while he and Michael debated the merits of various brands. The real test came when Emma's school announced a father-daughter dance. Michael mentioned it casually during one of their morning coffee sessions, and David immediately offered to handle any arrangements. "You don't have to," Michael started, but David cut him off. "I want to. Not with money, but with time. Let me help you do this right for her." Together, they transformed Michael's backyard into a practice dance floor. David hired a professional instructor who came 3 times a week to teach Michael proper dance steps. Emma would watch from the porch, giggling as her father stumbled through waltz moves, while David documented everything on his phone, not for social media or business contacts, but for their private family collection. One evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Michael found David still sitting on the porch, scrolling through the dance practice videos. "You're different," Michael observed, settling into the chair beside him. "The David I knew wouldn't have spent his evenings teaching his brother to dance." "The David you knew was a fool," David replied softly. He thought success meant something different than this. He gestured to the modest house, the well-worn furniture on the porch, the soccer ball lying in the yard. "I'm trying to learn what really matters." The night of the dance, David arrived early to help Emma get ready while Michael finished up at work. As he carefully braided her hair the way Sarah used to do a skill he'd secretly practiced for weeks, Emma looked at him through the mirror. "Uncle David," she said thoughtfully, "are you going to stay this time?" The question caught him off guard, and he met Michael's eyes in the doorway, not having heard him return. "Yes," David answered firmly, holding his brother's gaze. "I'm staying. For as long as you both want me here." Michael's expression softened, and for the first time since their reunion, David saw a glimmer of his younger brother, the one who had once looked up to him, who had trusted him completely. "Good," Michael said simply, but the word carried the weight of forgiveness beginning to take root. Building a relationship with Emma proved to be both the easiest and most challenging aspect of David's return to family life. The girl's natural openness and capacity for forgiveness made it simple to spend time together, but the weight of their true connection, the blood tie he couldn't yet reveal, added complexity to every interaction. Their bond began to form over Saturday morning soccer practices, where David would arrive early to help Emma warm up. He learned to read her moods, the way she bit her lip when frustrated, how she bounced on her toes when excited, gestures so reminiscent of Sarah that they sometimes took his breath away. Each similarity to their sister was both a gift and a reminder of what he'd lost. The first real test came during a school presentation about family trees. Emma had proudly announced that she wanted to include her Uncle David, but struggled to explain their connection to her classmates. "Why haven't we seen him before?" they asked. Where was he all this time? Their innocent questions left Emma confused and hurt, seeking answers David wasn't ready to give. That evening, finding Emma quiet and withdrawn, David took her for ice cream, their growing tradition for difficult days. As they sat in the small parlor, Emma finally voiced her confusion. "Why didn't you want to know us before?" she asked, her small voice trembling. "Did you not like me?" David felt his heart shatter. Setting aside his sundae, he knelt before her chair. "Emma, listen to me," he said firmly. "There was never, ever a moment when I didn't like you. I made terrible mistakes, grown-up mistakes that had nothing to do with you. But I promise you, I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Their relationship deepened through small moments. David learned to help with homework, discovering that Emma had inherited not just Sarah's looks, but their mother's gift for storytelling. He attended school plays, sitting beside Michael in uncomfortable auditorium chairs, both men beaming with pride as Emma delivered her lines perfectly. But there were challenging moments too, like when Emma found an old photo album and asked about her grandmother's funeral, why wasn't Uncle David in any of the pictures? Or when she innocently mentioned how much he looked like her mother, causing both men to exchange panicked glances. Each near revelation was a reminder of the complicated truth they harbored. The hardest moment came during a thunderstorm when Emma called David in tears. She'd had a nightmare about losing her father the way she'd lost her mother, and Michael was working late at school. David broke every speed limit getting to her, finding her curled up on the couch, clutching a photo of Sarah. "I don't want to forget her," Emma whispered as David held her. Sometimes I can't remember what her voice sounded like. David pulled out his phone, showing her a video he'd finally recovered from old files. Sarah at a family barbecue, laughing as she tried to teach Michael to dance. Emma watched transfixed, her small hand gripping David's tightly. Their weekend routines became sacred. Sunday mornings were for pancakes, David insisting on cooking despite his limited culinary skills, Emma giggling at his failed attempts to flip them. They developed their own language of inside jokes and shared looks, building the kind of bond that made others assume they'd been close forever instead of just a few months. But underneath every shared laugh, every proud moment at a soccer game, every quiet evening helping with homework, David carried the weight of their secret. Sometimes he'd catch Michael watching them together, seeing the same thoughts reflected in his brother's eyes, how much Emma was like Sarah, how their family's truth remained hidden beneath layers of protection and love. The turning point in their relationship came unexpectedly during a school art project. Emma had to create a portrait of someone who inspired her. She chose David, but not for his business success or wealth. Because she explained to her class, he showed me that it's never too late to come home. Just as David was finding his footing in his reconstructed family life, Lindsay Parker walked into his office on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning, carrying news that would shake his world's foundation once again. She looked different from the ambitious young lawyer he'd dated a decade ago, softer around the edges, but with the same determined set to her jaw that had first caught his attention. "We need to talk, David," she said, declining his assistant's offer of coffee. "About something I should have told you years ago." There was a weight to her words that made David's chest tighten, a premonition of another life-altering revelation. He dismissed his assistant with a wave, noticing how Lindsay's hands trembled as she pulled out a photograph from her purse. The image showed a young boy around Emma's age with David's eyes and Lindsay's smile. "His name is Ethan," she said quietly. "He's 8 years old. He's your son." The words hit David like physical blows, each one forcing the air from his lungs. The boy in the photo was undeniably his, the same cleft chin, the same serious expression he'd seen in his own childhood photos. David started, but Lindsay cut him off. "I found out I was pregnant right after you ended things. You were so focused on building your empire, so clear about not wanting distractions. I convinced myself I was protecting both of you by staying away." Her voice carried years of justification, of doubt, of choices made and questioned. David stared at the photo, his mind racing. Another child, another family connection he'd missed, another person he'd failed without even knowing they existed. Why now, he managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "After all these years, why tell me now?" Lindsay's expression softened with something like sympathy. "Because Ethan's asking questions. Because I've seen the news about your company's charitable work with children's organizations. Because—" She hesitated. "Because he deserves to know his father, and you deserve to know your son." The irony wasn't lost on David. Just as he was learning to be an uncle, learning to rebuild trust with Michael and Emma, life presented him with an even greater challenge. "Does he know about me?" he asked, unable to take his eyes off the photograph. Lindsay nodded slowly. "He knows you're his father, that you didn't know about him. He's a remarkable boy, David, understanding beyond his years." As Lindsay shared stories about Ethan, his love for soccer, another cosmic irony, his talent for mathematics, his quiet determination, David felt the weight of missed moments crushing him anew. First birthdays, first steps, first days of school, all lost to time and circumstances. "I want to meet him," David said firmly, surprising himself with the immediacy of his decision. "If he's willing, if you're willing. I want to be part of his life." Lindsay's relief was visible, as if she'd been carrying this burden alone for too long. "He wants to meet you too. But David," she added cautiously, "he's not the only one who needs to know about this." Michael and Emma. The thought of adding another layer of complexity to their carefully rebuilding relationship made David's head spin. How would he explain this to them? How would Emma react to having a cousin her own age? How would Michael handle another example of David's past affecting their present? "This won't be easy," Lindsay said, reading his expression. "Blending families never is. But Ethan's worth it. He's been watching videos of you online, reading about your company. He's proud even without knowing you. Imagine how much more there could be." As Lindsay stood to leave, she placed another photo on his desk, a more recent one of Ethan at a school science fair, holding a first-place ribbon. "He has your drive," she said softly. "And your heart, though you might not believe that about yourself anymore." David sat alone in his office long after Lindsay left, the photographs of Ethan before him, his phone buzzing with messages he couldn't bring himself to answer. Just when he thought he'd found his way back to family, life had shown him how much more there was to discover, to repair, to build. The day everything changed began with a simple bruise. Emma had fallen during soccer practice, a normal occurrence, but the purple mark on her knee didn't fade. Instead, it spread, accompanied by a fatigue that seemed to drain the usual sparkle from her eyes. Michael noticed first, his paternal instincts triggering alarm bells that David initially tried to dismiss as overprotection. "She's just tired from school," David suggested one evening, watching Emma doze on the couch before dinner had even been served. But when she developed a fever that wouldn't break, both men knew something was wrong. The local clinic referred them to a specialist, and suddenly their world of soccer games and homework helped transformed into one of blood tests and worried whispers. The diagnosis came on a grey Tuesday morning. Dr. Sarah Bennett, the irony of her first name not lost on either brother, sat them down in her office, her expression carefully neutral as she delivered the news. The tests show that Emma has severe aplastic anemia, she explained, using terms that seemed to blur together in David's panic. Her bone marrow isn't producing enough new blood cells. Michael gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What do we do?" The doctor's response was measured, professional, but the gravity in her tone was unmistakable. "Emma needs a bone marrow transplant. The closer the genetic match, the better her chances." David felt the world tilt on its axis. Their secret, Sarah's true relationship to them, Emma's blood connection to him, suddenly carried life or death implications. He watched as Dr. Bennett explained the testing process, how they would screen family members first, knowing that the truth would have to come out now, one way or another. Emma sat in the children's ward, surrounded by bright murals and gentle nurses, unaware of the storm brewing around her. She was pale, too pale, but still managed to smile when David and Michael entered her room. "The doctor says I'm special," she announced, holding up a bright purple bandage from her latest blood draw. "She says I need new bone marrow, like getting new parts for a car." David caught Michael's eye over Emma's head, seeing his own fear reflected there. They had been tested first, of course, along with any potential donors in their immediate family. But now, watching Emma's brave attempt at normalcy, David realized they needed to cast a wider net. The truth about Sarah, about their family's complex genetics, could no longer remain hidden. That night, after Emma had finally fallen asleep in her hospital bed, David and Michael stood at the window of her room, watching the city lights flicker below. "We have to tell her," David said quietly. "About Sarah, about everything. Her doctors need to know our full family history." Michael nodded slowly, his face etched with exhaustion and worry. "I know. But how do we explain something so complicated when she's already dealing with so much?" The following days became a blur of medical consultations and potential donor screenings. David threw his considerable resources into the search, his business empire momentarily forgotten as he focused solely on saving his niece. He watched as Emma grew weaker, her soccer uniform hanging untouched in her closet, her school books gathering dust on her bedside table. The breaking point came when Emma asked about her mother's family. Could they help, she wondered aloud, innocent of the weight her question carried. "Maybe I have cousins somewhere who could be a match." David and Michael exchanged glances, knowing the moment had arrived. The truth could no longer wait. The revelation about Ethan couldn't have come at a more critical time. As David sat in his office late one night, reviewing Emma's medical files for the 100th time, the connection suddenly hit him with stunning clarity. Ethan wasn't just his son, he was Emma's cousin, sharing the same complex genetic heritage through David's bloodline. With trembling hands, he dialed Lindsay's number, not caring that it was well past midnight. "Lindsay," he said when she answered, his voice urgent, "I need to tell you something about Emma." He explained the situation rapidly, years of corporate presentations helping him maintain clarity despite his racing heart. Lindsay listened in silence, the weight of his words settling between them. "You're saying Emma is your niece," she said finally. "Not just by marriage, but by blood. And you think Ethan might be a match?" The hope in her voice matched the desperate prayer in David's heart. "We need to test him," he replied. "If you're willing." "If he's willing. I know it's a lot to ask." Lindsay's response was immediate. "Of course. But David, this means telling Ethan everything. About you, about why you weren't there. He'll have questions." David closed his eyes, feeling the weight of all his past decisions pressing down on him. "I know. I'll tell him everything. No more secrets." The next morning, David faced perhaps his hardest challenge, yet explaining to Michael why their best hope might lie with a nephew he didn't know existed. The conversation in Michael's kitchen was tense, the coffee between them growing cold as David revealed this final secret from his past. "A son," Michael repeated, his voice hollow. "You have a son Emma's age, and you're just telling me this now?" David watched his brother's hands clench into fists, then slowly relax. "Does Emma know about any of this?" David shook his head. "No one knew. I just found out myself." "But Michael, he might be her best chance." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant beeping of Emma's monitors from her room. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "All these years I thought I knew all your secrets, thought I understood the depth of what you'd walked away from. But this..." He gestured helplessly. "How do we even begin to explain this to Emma?" The answer came sooner than expected. That afternoon, Ethan and Lindsay arrived at the hospital for preliminary testing. David watched through the window as his son, this serious-faced boy who had his eyes and Lindsay's gentle smile, sat patiently while the nurses drew blood. Ethan hadn't asked many questions yet, accepting the simplified explanation that a cousin needed help, but David knew the harder conversations were coming. Emma was awake when Ethan first peeked into her room, curious about the cousin he'd never known. Despite her weakness, her face lit up at the sight of someone her own age. "You look like Uncle David," she observed, making both adults in the room freeze. Ethan glanced at his father, then back at Emma. "He's my dad," he said simply, with the straightforward honesty of children. The silence that followed was broken by Emma's soft, "Oh." She looked between David and Ethan, her tired mind processing this new information. Then, with the resilience that had amazed them all throughout her illness, she simply patted the edge of her bed. "Want to see my comic books? The nurses brought me new ones yesterday." The revelation of Ethan's existence created ripples through the already fragile family dynamic. Michael, despite his initial shock, found himself watching the easy interaction between Emma and Ethan with a mixture of gratitude and resentment. The children had formed an instant bond, unencumbered by the complex web of adult relationships surrounding them, but the truth about their connection still loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. One evening, after the preliminary tests showed promising results, Michael confronted David in the hospital corridor. "You should have told me," he said, his voice low and controlled. "About Ethan, about Lindsay, about all of it. We're supposed to be rebuilding trust, David. How many more secrets are you keeping?" David leaned against the sterile wall, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. "I didn't know about him until recently," he explained for what felt like the 100th time. "And then Emma got sick, and everything happened so fast." Michael's bitter laugh cut him off. "That's always been your excuse, hasn't it? Everything happening too fast, no time to think about family." Their argument might have escalated further if Lindsay hadn't appeared, her expression stern. "Not here," she said firmly, nodding toward Emma's room where both children were visible through the window. They don't need to see this. Her intervention forced both men to step back, to remember what was really at stake. The tension reached its peak when the time came to explain the full truth to Emma and Ethan. The four adults, David, Michael, Lindsay, and Dr. Bennett, gathered in Emma's hospital room, facing two children who sensed the gravity of the moment. "There's something we need to tell you both," David began, his corporate confidence deserting him completely. The story unfolded in pieces, each adult adding their part. They explained about Sarah, about adoption and hidden connections, about how Ethan and Emma were more than just cousins. They were bound by blood ties that none of them had known existed until recently. Emma listened with wide eyes, her small hand finding Ethan's as the truth emerged. "So my mum was your sister?" Emma asked David, her voice trembling. "And you didn't know?" The pain in her question cut through all the adult complications. David moved to her bedside, kneeling to meet her eyes. "No, sweetheart, I didn't know. And I'll regret that for the rest of my life." Ethan's reaction was quieter but no less profound. He looked at his father, then at Emma, processing the reality that the cousin he'd just met was connected to him in ways none of them had imagined. "Is that why you want my bone marrow?" he asked finally. "Because we're really family." Lindsay stepped forward, her hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We want to test if you're a match because you might be able to help Emma get better," she explained gently. "Being family just means we found each other at exactly the right time." The children's acceptance of the situation shamed the adults into reconciliation. Watching Emma and Ethan laugh over shared comics, exchange stories about school, and face medical tests together with mutual support forced David, Michael, and Lindsay to set aside their complicated history and focus on what mattered most. "They're showing us how it's done," Michael observed one evening, watching the children through the window. No grudges, no past baggage, just family. David nodded, feeling the weight of years of mistakes pressing down on him. "We could learn from them," he agreed softly. The healing began in small moments, Lindsay bringing coffee for everyone during long hospital waits, Michael helping Ethan with homework while David sat with Emma, all of them coming together around Emma's bed for movie nights on the hospital's small TV. Slowly, the adults learned to navigate their new reality, their shared concern for the children bridging gaps that had seemed insurmountable. While David focused on his family crisis, serpents were stirring in his corporate Eden. Richard Walsh, his longtime CFO and supposed friend, had been quietly orchestrating a hostile takeover, exploiting David's absence to sow doubts among the board members about his leadership capabilities. The first warning came in a late-night call from Rachel, his loyal assistant. "David, something's wrong," she said, her usual composure cracking. "Walsh called an emergency board meeting without notifying you. They're voting on a motion of no confidence." The news should have devastated him, but David found himself strangely calm, sitting in Emma's hospital room watching her sleep. The betrayal ran deeper than just Walsh. Documents began surfacing, carefully doctored to suggest financial mismanagement under David's leadership. Board members he'd trusted for years suddenly became unreachable, their secretaries offering polite excuses. The empire he'd spent a decade building was being dismantled piece by piece by piece, and for the first time in his life, David couldn't bring himself to care. Michael found him in the hospital cafeteria, staring at headlines announcing his company's plummeting stock prices. "I heard," Michael said simply, sliding a cup of coffee across the table. Walsh was on the morning news. "He's painting quite a picture." David looked up at his brother, expecting to see satisfaction at his corporate downfall. Instead, he found concern. "You're not fighting back," Michael observed. It wasn't a question. David shrugged, his eyes drifting toward the pediatric ward where Emma was undergoing another round of tests. "What's the point?" "Emma needs me here. The company. It's just money." The words surprised them both. They sounded nothing like the David Mitchell who had once chosen a board meeting over their mother's funeral. But Walsh wasn't content with merely taking control of the company. His attacks became personal, leaking stories to the press about David's abandoned family, twisting the narrative of his reconciliation with Michael into something calculating and cruel. The coverage threatened to disrupt Emma's peace in the hospital, with reporters trying to sneak onto the pediatric floor for photos of the billionaire's sick niece. The final straw came when Walsh attempted to freeze David's personal assets, claiming corporate misappropriation. The action would have halted the expensive medical treatments Emma desperately needed. For the first time since the crisis began, David felt the old fire return, not for his company, but for his family. "I need your help," he told Michael that evening, spreading documents across Emma's bedside table after she'd fallen asleep. "Walsh doesn't know about Sarah, about our real connection to Emma. He thinks this is all some publicity stunt." Michael studied the papers, his teacher's mind quickly grasping the implications. "You want to use the truth to fight back." David nodded slowly. "Not for the company. For Emma, for our family." The brothers worked through the night, piecing together their family story not as a weapon, but as a testament to redemption and rediscovered bonds. When Lindsay arrived the next morning with Ethan, She found them still working, united in purpose for the first time in decades. "Count me in," she said, reviewing their strategy. "I'm tired of hiding too." As a lawyer, Lindsay quickly identified the weaknesses in Walsh's legal assault. More importantly, she understood how to present their family's truth in a way that would neutralize his attacks without exploiting Emma's illness. The irony wasn't lost on David. His lifelong pursuit of corporate success had nearly destroyed his family, and now his family might be the key to saving everything he'd built. But as he watched Emma and Ethan playing cards, their laughter echoing through the hospital room, he realized that he'd finally learned to measure wealth in something other than dollars. The day Emma collapsed during a routine walk around the hospital ward, everything else ceased to matter. David was on the phone with his lawyers, discussing Walsh's latest moves, when he heard Michael's desperate shout echo down the corridor. He found them in the hallway, Emma unconscious in her father's arms, her skin pale as winter moonlight. The medical team descended in a blur of urgent voices and quick movements, pushing both men aside as they rushed Emma back to her room. Dr. Bennett's face was grim as she emerged hours later. "Her numbers are dropping faster than we anticipated," she explained, her professional demeanor barely masking her concern. "We need to move forward with the transplant immediately." Ethan's preliminary tests had shown promise, but the final compatibility results weren't due for another day. The waiting felt like torture, each hour marked by Emma's weakening vital signs. Michael refused to leave her bedside, holding her small hand and whispering stories about Sarah, about the mother she'd lost too young. David stood at the window, watching his brother and niece, feeling more helpless than he ever had in any boardroom crisis. All his wealth, all his business acumen, meant nothing in the face of Emma's failing health. Lindsay arrived with Ethan, who immediately went to Emma's bedside, his young face serious as he looked at his cousin's pale form. "Tell me again about the transplant," Ethan asked Dr. Bennett, his voice steady despite his obvious fear. The doctor explained the procedure once more, using simple terms that belied its complexity. Ethan nodded, squeezing Emma's hand. "I'm not scared," he declared, though his grip on his mother's arm suggested otherwise. Night fell, bringing no improvement. Emma drifted in and out of consciousness, her moments of lucidity filled with brave smiles that broke their hearts. During one clear moment, she looked at David with Sarah's eyes. "Uncle David," she whispered, "will you tell me about my mom?" The real story. The question brought all four adults to tears. The hospital room became their world, time measured in beeps of medical equipment and changes of IV bags. Michael paced endlessly, a caged tiger of paternal worry. David stood sentinel by the door, as if his presence could somehow ward off further decline. Lindsay managed them all, ensuring they ate, rested, remained human in their vigil. When Emma's fever spiked dangerously high in the pre-dawn hours, Dr. Bennett ordered ice packs and cooling blankets. David helped the nurses pack them around his niece's small body, remembering how she'd laughed just weeks ago during a water balloon fight in his backyard. The contrast between that vibrant child and this still form was almost unbearable. "She's a fighter," Michael said hoarsely, more to himself than anyone else. "Like Sarah." Like Mom, David gripped his brother's shoulder, the gesture conveying what words couldn't. They stood together, united in their fear and hope, all past grievances forgotten in the face of possibly losing Emma. Ethan refused to go home, camping out on the room's small couch, his presence a constant reminder of their last best hope. He watched the medical staff with solemn attention, asking quiet, intelligent questions about what each treatment was meant to do. His maturity in the crisis made David ache with pride and regret for all the years he'd missed. In the darkest hour of their vigil, when Emma's fever finally broke but left her weaker than ever, Michael pulled David aside into the quiet hospital chapel. From his wallet, worn and stretched with years of use, he extracted a letter even more weathered than Sarah's previous ones. The paper was yellowed, the creases so deep they threatened to tear. "Mum wrote this," Michael said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "The night before she died. I've been carrying it ever since, waiting for the right moment." David stared at the envelope, recognizing their mother's distinctive handwriting addressing it simply to "my sons." "I couldn't give it to you at the funeral," Michael continued. "You were so distant, watching from behind that tree. And after everything with Sarah, it never seemed like the right time." His hands trembled as he held out the letter. "But Emma's fighting for her life, and I think we both need to hear Mum's words now." David accepted the envelope with reverence, his fingers tracing the familiar script. Together they sat in the chapel's first pew, the sterile hospital air heavy with anticipation. As David began to read aloud, their mother's voice seemed to fill the small space. "My dearest David and Michael, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I pray you're reading it together. There's so much I should have told you both, about Sarah, about our family's past, about the choices that shaped all our lives. But my greatest regret is watching you drift apart, knowing I helped cause it with my secrets." David's voice cracked, but he continued reading. "David, my ambitious son, I've watched you build walls around your heart, turning success into a shield against love. And Michael, my tender boy, I've seen you shoulder burdens alone, too proud to ask for help. You're both so much like your father, stubborn, loving, afraid of showing weakness." The letter went on, revealing their mother's deepest hopes and fears. She wrote about Sarah, about watching her daughter from afar before fate brought her back into their lives. She described her joy at seeing Michael and Sarah fall in love, and her agony at keeping the truth hidden. "But my final wish," the letter concluded, "is for you to find your way back to each other. Family isn't just blood, it's choice, it's forgiveness, it's love that survives secrets and silence. David, learn to open your heart. Michael, learn to forgive. And both of you, please remember that I loved you completely, even when I couldn't tell you everything." Silence fell in the chapel as David folded the letter with trembling hands. Both men sat there, shoulders touching, their mother's last words echoing in their minds. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "She knew, somehow, that we'd need these words today." "Why now?" David asked, still staring at the folded paper. After all this time, Michael glanced toward the chapel door, toward the ward where Emma fought for her life. "Because Emma's bringing us all together, just like Sarah did. And maybe," he hesitated, "maybe it's time we both listened to Mom's last wish." David nodded slowly, understanding flowing between them. Their mother's letter wasn't just about the past, it was about the future they needed to build. For Emma, for Ethan, for the family they were slowly reconstructing from the ashes of secrets and regret. The truth about Sarah's deeper connection to David emerged from a dusty box of hospital records that Lindsay discovered while searching for additional family medical history. Among the yellowed papers was a newspaper clipping from 20 years ago, featuring a story about a car accident on the outskirts of their hometown. The article mentioned a young woman who had pulled an unconscious teenager from a burning vehicle. "David," Lindsay called softly, her voice trembling as she read the article. "The woman who saved you." It was Sarah. David took the paper with shaking hands, memories of that night flooding back. He'd been 17, driving home from a late-night study session when a deer darted across the road. The crash had left him trapped, unconscious, until a mysterious guardian angel had appeared. The article included a photo of the scene, and there she was, Sarah, younger but unmistakable, refusing to give her name to reporters before disappearing into the night. She had known, even then, who he was. Their mother must have shared photos, stories. Sarah had saved her unknown brother's life and never revealed herself. More evidence surfaced as they dug deeper. A series of letters Sarah had written to their mother mentioned watching David from afar, seeing him graduate high school, following his early business success through news articles. She had kept track of her brothers while maintaining her distance, respecting the complicated circumstances of her adoption. "She was always there," Michael said quietly, examining a photograph they found of David's college graduation. In the background, barely visible, stood Sarah. She wanted to know her brothers, but she was afraid of disrupting our lives. The revelation hit David like a physical blow. All those years he'd been building his empire, his sister had been silently watching, protecting, loving from a distance. Among Sarah's belongings, they found a journal. The final entry, dated the day of her fatal accident, revealed her ultimate intention: I'm going to tell David everything today. Life is too short for secrets, and Emma deserves to know her full family. Mom was right, some truths are worth any risk. The journal fell from David's hands, landing on the hospital floor with a soft thud. Sarah had died trying to reach him, trying to bridge the gap between them. The same determination he now saw in Emma's fight for life had driven Sarah to make that final attempt at connection. Lindsay found him later in Emma's room, watching his niece sleep while holding Sarah's journal. She saved my life, he said quietly, and I never knew. I never got to thank her. Lindsay placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, understanding the weight of this revelation. Maybe you can thank her now, she suggested, by saving Emma's life. By being the brother she always knew you could be. The truth about Sarah's role in David's past added another layer of complexity to their already intricate family story. But it also provided a kind of closure, an understanding of how deeply their lives had been intertwined even when they didn't realize it. Sarah had been their guardian angel, watching over both brothers in her own way. Lindsay's own revelation came late one night in Emma's hospital room, after both children had fallen asleep. The weight of watching Ethan prepare for his role as Emma's donor had finally broken down her carefully constructed walls. She pulled David aside, her composure cracking for the first time since their reunion. I need to tell you the real reason I kept Ethan from you, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't just about your career or my pride. She pulled out an old letter from her bag, the paper creased and worn from repeated handling. The letterhead bore the name of David's former mentor and business partner, James Harrison. James came to see me when I was 3 months pregnant, Lindsay continued, her hands trembling. He said he was acting on your behalf, that you'd confided in him about our relationship. He offered me money to disappear, to keep quiet about the baby. David felt the blood drain from his face as she spoke. He said you'd authorized him to handle the situation. The truth hit David like a physical blow. James Harrison, the man who had guided his early career, who had helped him build his empire, had acted without his knowledge, believing he was protecting his protégé's interests. Lindsay, I never knew. David breathed. I never told him about us, about any of it. I know that now, Lindsay replied softly. But at the time it made sense. You were so focused on your career, so determined to succeed. The idea that you'd want to avoid a scandal, a child. She trailed off, years of hurt evident in her voice. I was young and scared, and it seemed to confirm every fear I had about telling you. The revelation cast their past in a harsh new light. While David had been climbing the corporate ladder, believing Lindsay had simply moved on, she had been protecting their son from what she thought was his father's rejection. The cruel irony was that James Harrison had died 2 years ago, taking the truth of his manipulation to the grave. After James died, I started seeing news about your charitable work, your focus on children's causes, Lindsay explained. You seemed different, more human. When Ethan started asking about you, I decided it was time to know the truth for myself. She managed a weak smile. I never expected to find you here, like this, helping save your niece. David sat heavily in one of the hospital chairs, the weight of this new knowledge pressing down on him. All these years, he murmured, all this lost time with Ethan, because James thought he was protecting me. Lindsay reached out, hesitantly touching his arm. We can't change the past, David, but we're here now, all of us, when Emma needs us most. Maybe that's not a coincidence. The truth of her words settled over them as they watched their son sleeping peacefully beside his cousin's hospital bed. The machinations of the past had kept them apart, but fate or perhaps something more deliberate had brought them together when it mattered most. Michael's own confession came the night before Ethan's scheduled donation procedure. Standing in the hospital chapel where they had read their mother's letter, he finally unburdened himself of the secret he'd carried since Sarah's death. "I knew she was going to see you that day," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I could have stopped her. Should have stopped her. The roads were icy, the weather was terrible, but she was so determined." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of helpless regret. "I let her go because I was angry at you, angry enough to let her take that risk." David stood silent, absorbing the weight of his brother's confession. The guilt that had haunted Michael for years was visible in every line of his face. "She called me from the road," Michael continued, his voice breaking. "Asked me to tell you something if anything happened. I never delivered the message." From his wallet, Michael withdrew a final note, written in Sarah's hurried hand on the back of a gas station receipt. She wrote it at her last stop, just an hour before the accident. The paper trembled in his hands as he passed it to David. The message was simple but devastating. "Tell David I forgive him. Tell him to come home." "I couldn't give it to you," Michael whispered. "Not at the funeral, not after. I wanted you to carry the guilt I felt. I wanted you to hurt like I was hurting." The confession hung between them in the chapel's quiet air. "But watching Emma now, seeing her fight so hard, seeing how much she loves you despite everything, I can't carry this anymore." David read the note again, Sarah's last words blurring through his tears. "You were protecting her memory," he said finally, "like you've protected Emma. I understand that better now." He looked at his brother, seeing not the anger of recent years, but the shared grief of two men who had lost too much. "Emma has your heart," David continued softly. "Your capacity for forgiveness. Sarah's too. I see it every time she looks at me, every time she welcomes Ethan without question. She's teaching us both how to heal." Michael nodded, tears tracking down his face. The brothers stood in silence, the weight of their shared history settling between them like a bridge instead of a barrier. Through the chapel window they could see into Emma's room, where she slept peacefully, Ethan in the chair beside her, both children unaware of the adult burdens being lifted in their name. "Tomorrow," Michael said finally, "Ethan's going to help save my daughter's life. Our niece. Sarah would have loved that, her son saving her daughter. Maybe this is her way of bringing us all back together." David placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, feeling years of tension dissolve under his touch. "We can't change what happened," David replied, echoing Lindsay's earlier wisdom. "But we can honor Sarah's last wish. We can come home, all of us, to the family she always wanted us to be." The chapel's quiet seemed to embrace their reconciliation, as if Sarah herself were witnessing this long-overdue healing. The morning of the transplant dawned crisp and clear, as if nature itself had paused to witness the moment. Ethan sat on his hospital bed, looking small in his medical gown but determined beyond his years. Emma had been prepped in another room, her tiny body already weakened by the preparatory treatments. "Are you scared?" David asked his son softly, sitting beside him. Ethan shook his head, though his tight grip on his father's hand suggested otherwise. "Emma needs this," he said simply. "She's my cousin, my real cousin, and family helps family." The words, so innocent yet profound, brought tears to everyone's eyes. Lindsay and Michael waited with Emma, each holding one of her hands as the medical team made their final preparations. David moved between both rooms, a living bridge between the two children who had brought their fractured family back together. Dr. Bennett oversaw everything personally, her calm presence reassuring them all. The procedure itself was surprisingly peaceful. Ethan remained brave throughout, chatting with the nurses about his favorite video games as they collected his bone marrow. In her room, Emma drifted in and out of sleep, her usual sparkle dimmed but not extinguished. The family maintained their vigil, hours stretching into a blur of coffee cups and whispered prayers. When it was done, when Ethan's precious cells had been transferred to Emma, an unexpected peace settled over them all. The waiting began days of monitoring, of watching for signs that Emma's body was accepting this gift from her cousin. Ethan insisted on being wheeled to her room as soon as he was able, the two children sharing popsicles and trading gentle fist bumps. The first positive signs came gradually. Emma's color improved, her blood counts began to rise, and her energy slowly returned. Each small victory was celebrated by the entire floor nurses who had grown to love the brave little girl, doctors who had fought alongside her, and the family that had been reformed through her struggle. A week after the transplant, Emma asked for her soccer ball. Though she could barely kick it from her bed to the door, the request brought joyful tears to Michael's eyes. It was the first time she'd shown interest in anything beyond surviving. Ethan, still moving carefully himself, stood at the foot of her bed as a makeshift goalkeeper, making exaggerated dives at her gentle kicks. The real turning point came when Dr. Bennett announced that Emma's body was showing no signs of rejection. The genetic match was perfect, she explained, smiling at both children. Sometimes the closest family ties are the ones we discover when we need them most. The adults exchanged knowing looks, understanding the deeper truth in her words. As Emma grew stronger, the hospital room that had been their world for so long began to feel less like a medical space and more like a family gathering place. The walls were covered with drawings from both children, cards from well-wishers, and photos that told the story of their evolving family. Even the nurses commented on how unusual it was to see so much joy in an oncology ward. The day Emma was discharged from the hospital marked more than just her medical recovery. The entire family gathered in her room, David, Michael, Lindsay, and Ethan watching as she packed her beloved get-well cards and drawings with careful attention. The atmosphere was different now, lighter somehow, as if the shared ordeal had washed away years of hurt and misunderstanding. "I want to have a family dinner," Emma announced, looking around at the adults with Sarah's determined expression. A real one, with everyone together. At Uncle David's house, since its biggest, the simplicity of her request brought smiles to everyone's faces. Even Michael, who had once sworn never to set foot in his brother's mansion, found himself nodding in agreement. The dinner itself became a turning point in their collective healing. David's formal dining room, usually reserved for business meetings, was transformed by children's laughter and casual conversation. Emma and Ethan sat together, their bond now cemented by more than just shared blood, while the adults watched in amazement at how easily they had created their own little tribe. During dessert, Michael raised his glass in an impromptu toast. "To family," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "To second chances, and to the children who showed us how to forgive." David caught his brother's eye across the table, seeing in it all the unspoken understanding they had finally achieved. The wall between them, built of pride and pain, had crumbled under the weight of their shared love for Emma and Ethan. Lindsay, watching the brothers exchange, added her own quiet words. "To Sarah," she said softly, "who brought us all together in ways we never expected. The name that had once caused such tension now brought gentle smiles." They could speak of her freely now, sharing stories that helped Emma and Ethan understand the remarkable woman who had touched all their lives. Later that evening, as the children played in the backyard under the warm sunset, David found himself standing between his brother and Lindsay, watching their children chase fireflies. "We're going to do this right," he said firmly. "All of us together. No more secrets, no more distance." Michael nodded, clapping his hand on David's shoulder. Sarah would have loved this, he said. Seeing her family whole at last, the touch lingered, no longer awkward or hesitant, but warm with restored brotherhood. Lindsay smiled, watching Ethan show Emma how to cup the fireflies gently in his hands. The transformation in their relationships was subtle but profound. Sunday dinners became a tradition, rotating between homes but most often at David's, where the children had claimed the pool as their domain. Business meetings were scheduled around soccer games and school events, Birthday celebrations doubled in size and joy, with 2 children to celebrate and 3 parents to spoil them. "We're a bit unconventional," Lindsay observed one evening, watching the newly formed family dynamic unfold. "But maybe that's what makes it work." She was right. Their family defied traditional labels, bound together by choice as much as blood. The love between them had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, purer for the trial. The final board meeting of Mitchell Enterprises took place on a Thursday afternoon, exactly 1 month after Emma's release from the hospital. David stood before the assembled directors, his posture relaxed in a way that would have been unthinkable just months ago. Walsh sat at the far end, his face tight with barely concealed triumph as he prepared to watch his former mentor's downfall. "Gentlemen," David began, "I've called this meeting to announce my decision regarding the company's future." He paused, glancing at the family photo now prominently displayed on his desk. Emma and Ethan at the pool, Michael and Lindsay laughing in the background. "I'm selling my controlling interest in Mitchell Enterprises." The boardroom erupted in shocked whispers. Walsh's triumphant smile froze, then faltered as David continued. "But not to you, Richard. I'm selling to Harrison Industries with one condition: that they maintain our children's medical research division with full funding for the next 20 years. The decision had come to him during one of Emma's follow-up appointments, watching other families struggle with the same fears and hopes they had faced. His wealth could serve a greater purpose than personal gain or corporate power plays. "My father once told me that success was about building something that lasts." David addressed the stunned board. "I thought he meant business empires. I was wrong. What lasts is family. What matters is the legacy we leave in lives touched, not dollars earned." That evening, David hosted a family dinner to share his news. Emma and Ethan were in the pool, their laughter providing a soundtrack to the adults' conversation. "Are you sure about this?" Michael asked, concern evident in his voice. "You've built this company from nothing." David smiled, watching his son teach Emma a new swimming technique. "I built it instead of building relationships. Instead of being there for Mom, for Sarah, for you. I'm choosing differently now." Lindsay squeezed his hand, understanding the weight of his decision. The sale would leave him wealthy enough to maintain their comfortable lifestyle, but no longer a billionaire. The business world was already buzzing with speculation about his downfall, but standing there with his family, David had never felt richer. "Besides," he added, pulling out architectural plans from his briefcase, "I have a new project in mind." The blueprints showed a medical research facility, its focus on pediatric diseases. "The Sarah Mitchell Children's Research Center," he announced. "A real legacy in our sister's name." Michael's eyes welled with tears as he studied the plans. Emma and Ethan, drawn by the adults' emotional response, dripped pool water on the blueprints as they examined their future contribution to the family story. "Can we help?" Emma asked, her eyes bright with purpose. "For Mom." "For everything," David answered, gathering his family close. "For second chances, for forgiveness, for love that survives all our mistakes." The setting sun painted them in golden light, a family reformed through trial and grace, choosing each other over everything else. Dear readers, if this story of redemption, family bonds, and second chances has touched your heart, we invite you to join our storytelling community. Share your thoughts in the comments about how family has shaped your own life. Your experiences might inspire others on their journey of healing and reconciliation. Subscribe to support our team's commitment to bringing you more compelling narratives that explore the depths of human relationships. Help us spread these messages of hope by sharing this story with friends and family who might need its healing touch. Every like, comment, and share helps us continue crafting stories that remind us of what truly matters in life. Thank you for being part of our storytelling family.